My name is Emma. I'm 28 years old. And the story I'm about to share with you isn't just a story, it's a painful truth that changed my life forever. From the outside, everything looked perfect. I had a successful business, a comfortable life, and a family that seemed to love and support me. I was always there for them, helping, giving, sacrificing, without ever questioning their intentions. But one day, I decided to test something. I told them I had lost everything, that I was broke, that I needed them. And what happened next? I never expected. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this from? Let me know your country in the comments below. And if you enjoy real, emotional stories like this, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more. Now, let me tell you what really happened after that day. My name is Emma, and for most of my life, I believed I had everything anyone could ever ask for. I was 28 years old, running a growing business that I had built from the ground up, living in a beautiful house and surrounded by a family that always seemed proud of me. People used to say I was lucky, and honestly, I used to believe that too. Every family gathering felt warm, full of laughter and filled with compliments about how far I had come. My parents would introduce me to relatives with a smile. My siblings would talk about my success like it was their own achievement, and everyone treated me like I was the backbone of the family. I never questioned any of it. I thought this was what love looked like. Whenever someone in my family needed help, I was always the first person they called. Whether it was money, advice, or support, I gave it without hesitation. My younger brother once needed funds to start a small business, and I didn't even think twice before transferring the money. My sister often relied on me to cover her expenses once she fell short, and I always told her not to worry about paying me back. Even my parents depended on me more than they would admit, especially when it came to financial matters. I convinced myself that this was normal, that this was what family was supposed to do for each other. And maybe, in some way, it is. But looking back now, I realize something important. I was always giving, but I never stopped to see what I was receiving in return. The truth is, there were small signs. Little moments that didn't feel right but were easy to ignore at the time. Like how conversations would suddenly become quieter whenever I mentioned I was cutting back on spending. Or how some relatives would lose interest in talking to me when I couldn't immediately help them with something. Even during family dinners, I noticed that most of the attention I got came when I talked about my business or achievements. It was as if my value in the room was directly connected to my success. But I pushed those thoughts aside. I told myself I was overthinking. After all, they were my family. They loved me, didn't they? There was only one person who didn't see things the way I did. My husband, Daniel. Daniel was calm, observant, and rarely spoke unless he had something important to say. He watched everything quietly, noticing details I often missed. In the beginning, I used to think he was just being overly cautious, or even a little negative when it came to my family. Whenever he brought up his concerns, I would immediately defend them. They care about me, I would say. You just don't understand how close we are. He never argued. He would just nod and let the conversation drop, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. One evening, after a family dinner, we were driving home in silence. I was smiling, still thinking about how my parents had praised my recent business deal. It made me feel proud, appreciated, and loved. But Daniel suddenly broke the silence. "Emma," he said softly, "have you ever noticed how they only come to you when they need something?" I frowned, a little annoyed. That's not true. They just rely on me because I'm capable. He glanced at me for a moment, then back at the road. There's a difference between relying on someone and using them. His words stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. I tried to brush them off, but they kept coming back, especially when I started paying closer attention. I began noticing patterns I had ignored before. Calls that always started sweet, but ended with a request. Messages that felt warm until I said I was busy or unable to help. Subtle disappointment in their tone when I didn't immediately say yes. It made me uncomfortable. Not because I fully believed Daniel was right, but because a part of me was starting to wonder if he might be. Disclaimer: This story is created for inspirational and entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons or events is purely coincidental. The content is intended to motivate and educate, and not to offend or target anyone. A few days later, we were sitting together at home, and I finally brought it up again. "Do you really think my family only cares about what I can give them?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked at me carefully, like he was choosing his words with precision. "I think they love the version of you that makes their lives easier," he said. "But I don't know if they would stay the same if that version disappeared." I felt a tightness in my chest hearing that. It sounded harsh, almost unfair. These were the people who had raised me, supported me, and celebrated my success. How could their love be conditional? "That's not true," I said firmly. "They would never leave me like that." Daniel leaned back slightly, his expression calm but serious. "I hope you're right," he replied. "But sometimes, the only way to know the truth is to stop giving people what they expect from you." That sentence changed something inside me. It didn't convince me immediately, but it planted a seed of doubt I couldn't ignore anymore. For the first time, I started questioning everything I had always believed about my family. I started wondering what would happen if I wasn't the strong, successful, dependable person they were used to. What if I became someone who needed help instead of giving it? Would they still be there for me the same way I had always been there for them? Or would everything I thought was love start to disappear the moment I had nothing left to offer? The idea didn't come to me all at once. It built slowly, growing stronger every time I replayed Daniel's words in my mind. I kept asking myself the same question. What if everything I believed about my family wasn't completely true? It felt uncomfortable, almost wrong, to even think that way. These were the people I trusted the most. But the doubt had already settled in, and ignoring it was no longer possible. For days, I tried to push the thought away. I told myself I didn't need to test anything. I told myself that love shouldn't be questioned like this. But deep down, I knew something had changed. I wasn't as sure as I used to be. And that uncertainty was eating me from the inside. I needed clarity, even if it hurt. One evening, I sat with Daniel in the living room, staring at my phone. I had been thinking about it all day, going back and forth in my head. Finally, I took a deep breath and said, "I'm going to do it." He looked at me, already understanding what I meant. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. I nodded, even though my heart was racing. "I need to know." There was no dramatic planning, no complicated setup. The idea was simple, but the impact I expected from it felt heavy. I decided I would tell my family that I had lost everything, that my business had failed, that I was in debt, and that I needed support. It was just a lie, but it felt like I was about to cross a line I could never uncross. I chose to call for a family gathering the next day. I told them it was important. My voice sounded normal on the phone, but inside, I was nervous. I didn't know what I was about to discover, and that uncertainty made my chest feel tight. The next evening, everyone arrived at my house. My parents sat together on the couch, my siblings spread out across the room, and the usual noise filled the air. For a moment, everything looked exactly the same as it always had. Laughter, casual conversations, small jokes. It all felt familiar. It almost made me want to stop right there and forget the entire plan. But I couldn't. Not anymore. I stood up slowly, trying to steady my hands. "I need to talk to all of you," I said. The room quieted down. Everyone turned their attention toward me, waiting. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, loud and fast. For a second, I hesitated. This was the moment where I could still change my mind. But instead, I forced myself to continue. "I've been dealing with something serious," I began, keeping my voice as calm as possible. "My business, it didn't work out the way I expected. I've lost a lot of money." No one interrupted. They were listening, but their expressions had already started to shift. "I'm in debt," I added, the words feeling heavier than I imagined. "I've basically lost everything." Silence filled the room. It wasn't the kind of silence I expected. It wasn't concerned or emotional. It was distant. My mother's face, which had been warm just moments ago, suddenly looked tense. My father leaned back slightly, his brows furrowed, not in worry, but in calculation. My brother avoided eye contact completely, staring down at his hands. My sister picked up her phone, pretending to check something, even though she had been fully engaged just seconds before. I waited. I expected someone to ask if I was okay. I expected at least one person to stand up, come closer, or show some kind of emotional reaction. But nothing came. Instead, my father spoke first. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "How much do you owe?" The question hit me harder than I expected. Not because of the words themselves, but because of what was missing from them. There was no concern, no reassurance, no "we'll figure this out together." Just numbers. I'm still calculating," I replied softly. My mother sighed quietly, crossing her arms. "You should have been more careful," she said. "You were doing so well." Her tone wasn't comforting. It sounded like disappointment mixed with frustration. My brother finally spoke, but he didn't look at me. "These things happen," he muttered, his voice flat, like he didn't want to be involved in the conversation at all. My sister didn't say anything. She just stayed focused on her phone, occasionally glancing up with an expression I couldn't fully read, somewhere between awkward and uninterested. The room felt colder with every passing second. I tried to hold myself together, even though something inside me was already breaking. This wasn't what I expected. Even if they couldn't help financially, I thought they would at least show emotional support. I thought they would stand by me, reassure me, make me feel less alone. But instead, I felt like I had just become a problem they didn't want to deal with. "I might need some help," I said carefully, testing their reactions. That changed everything. The energy in the room shifted immediately. My father looked away, my mother pressed her lips together, and my brother leaned back as if creating distance. It was subtle, but it was clear. "We have our own responsibilities," my father said after a pause. "It's not easy for us either." My mother nodded in agreement. "You'll have to figure something out," she added. There was no hesitation in their refusal, even though I hadn't directly asked for a specific amount. It was as if they had already decided their answer before I even finished speaking. I looked around the room, hoping anyone would say something different, but no one did. In that moment, I felt something I had never felt before in their presence. Not sadness, not anger, but clarity. A quiet, undeniable understanding that something I had always believed in was no longer real. The change didn't happen all at once. It started quietly, almost in a way that could be ignored if I wasn't paying attention. The morning after that family meeting, I woke up with a strange feeling in my chest. It wasn't exactly sadness, and it wasn't anger either. It felt like something had shifted, like a part of my life had moved out of place and hadn't settled yet. I picked up my phone out of habit. Usually, there would be at least a few messages waiting. My sister sending something random, my mother checking in, or a missed call from a relative asking for help with something. But that morning, my screen was empty. No messages. No calls. Nothing. At first, I told myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe everyone was busy. Maybe they needed time to process what I had told them. That made sense, didn't it? After all, I had just shared something serious. People react differently. But as the hours passed, the silence stayed. By afternoon, I found myself checking my phone more often than I wanted to admit. Each time, I expected to see at least one message, something simple like, "Are you okay?" or "Let's talk." But there was nothing. It felt strange, because these were the same people who used to reach out to me constantly. Now it was as if I had disappeared from their world overnight. I tried not to overthink it, but the pattern became clearer over the next few days. The calls didn't come. The messages didn't come. And when I finally decided to reach out first, the responses were different. I called my sister one evening, trying to sound normal. "Hey, I just wanted to talk," I said. She hesitated before answering. I'm actually a bit busy right now, she replied quickly. Can we talk later? Sure, I said, even though something in her tone felt off. Later never came. The same thing happened with my brother. When I messaged him, his replies were short and delayed. Where he used to joke and chat, now he only responded with a few words, like he was trying to end the conversation as quickly as possible. My parents were no different. My mother, who used to call me almost every day, suddenly became distant. When she did speak, her voice lacked the warmth I was used to. She didn't ask about how I was handling everything. She didn't offer comfort. Instead, the conversations felt forced, like she was talking out of obligation rather than concern. It didn't take long for me to realize what was happening. They weren't just busy, they were pulling away. And the more I noticed it, the harder it became to ignore. Family gatherings stopped completely. No one invited me to anything anymore. There were no updates about events, no casual check-ins, nothing that made me feel included. It was like I had quietly been removed from their circle without anyone saying it out loud. One evening, I saw pictures on social media. My family had gathered at my parents' house for dinner. Everyone was there. My siblings, my cousins, even relatives who lived far away. They were smiling, laughing, enjoying themselves just like always. But I wasn't there, and no one had even told me about it. I stared at those pictures longer than I should have, not because I was jealous, but because I was trying to understand how everything could change so quickly. Just days ago, I was a central part of those gatherings. Now it was like I didn't exist. I put my phone down slowly, feeling a weight settle inside me. That was the moment it became undeniable. Their presence in my life had never been as unconditional as I believed. At home, Daniel noticed the shift in me even before I said anything. I was quieter, more withdrawn, lost in my own thoughts. One night, he sat beside me and asked, "Have they called?" I shook my head. He didn't look surprised. "They won't," he said gently. I didn't respond right away. Part of me still wanted to defend them, to find some explanation that would make all of this make sense. "Maybe they just don't know what to say," I said finally, though my voice lacked confidence. Daniel looked at me with a calm, steady expression. "Emma, when someone truly cares about you, they don't need the perfect words. They just show up." His words stayed with me. Because he was right. They didn't show up. Not when I told them I was struggling. Not when I needed support. Not even with something as simple as a message to ask if I was okay. Instead, they created distance. And the more distance they created, the clearer everything became. I started replaying past memories in my mind, but now I saw them differently. Moments that once felt like love now looked like transactions. Every time I helped them, they stayed close. Every time I was useful, I was valued. But the moment I appeared to have nothing to offer, their connection with me began to fade. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, slow, and painfully clear. I realized that I hadn't just lost their support. I had lost the illusion I had been holding on to for years, and for the first time, I stopped trying to hold on to them in return. By the time a week had passed, the silence from my family had turned into something heavier than I expected. It wasn't just the absence of calls or messages anymore, it was the feeling of being deliberately kept at a distance. Still, a part of me refused to fully accept it. I kept thinking maybe things would go back to normal if I just saw them in person. Maybe I was misunderstanding everything. Maybe they were just overwhelmed and didn't know how to react. That small hope pushed me to do something I hadn't done since the night I told them the lie. I decided to visit my parents. I didn't call before going. I didn't want to give them time to prepare or change their behavior. I wanted to see things as they really were. The drive to their house felt longer than usual, even though it was the same route I had taken countless times before. My hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel and my thoughts kept circling the same question: what if I was right about them? When I finally parked outside, everything looked the same. The house, the gate, the familiar surroundings. It all felt unchanged. For a brief moment, I felt a sense of comfort, like maybe I had been overthinking everything. Maybe this visit would prove that nothing had truly changed. I walked up to the door and reached for the handle, but before I could knock, I heard voices from inside. They didn't know I was there. I paused. Something about the tone of their conversation made me stay still. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough for me to understand. My mother was speaking first. "I don't understand how she let this happen," she said, her voice carrying a mix of frustration and disappointment. "She was doing so well. Now look at her." There was no sadness in her voice, no concern, just disappointment. My father responded after a short pause. "These things don't just happen," he said. "She must have made bad decisions." I felt my chest tighten, but I didn't move. I couldn't. "She's a burden now," my mother added quietly. That sentence hit harder than anything else. A burden. The word echoed in my mind, louder than their voices. For a second, I thought maybe I had misheard. Maybe I was taking it out of context. But deep down, I knew exactly what she meant. My father sighed. "We can't get involved," he said. "We have our own responsibilities. If we start helping her, it'll only drag us down too." I stood there, frozen. These were the same people I had spent years supporting without hesitation, the same people I had helped, defended, and trusted. And now, the moment they believed I had nothing left to give, they were talking about me like I was a problem they needed to avoid. There was no discussion about how I might be feeling, no concern about what I was going through, no plan to stand by me or help me recover, just distance, just avoidance. And just like that, the last piece of doubt inside me disappeared. I slowly stepped back from the door, careful not to make any noise. My heart was beating fast, but my mind felt strangely calm. It wasn't the kind of calm that comes from peace. It was the kind that comes when you finally understand something you've been denying for too long. I didn't knock. I didn't walk in. I didn't confront them. Because in that moment, I realized I didn't need to. They had already told me everything I needed to know. I walked back to my car, each step feeling heavier than the last. But I wasn't crying. I wasn't even angry in the way I thought I would be. Instead, I felt something deeper, something colder. Acceptance. Not acceptance of their behavior, but acceptance of the truth. The truth that their love had conditions. The truth that my value in their lives was tied to what I could provide. The truth that the moment I appeared weak or in need, I became someone they didn't want to deal with. I sat in my car for a while before starting the engine. My hands rested on the steering wheel, but I didn't move. I just stared ahead, replaying their words in my mind. "She's a burden now." It no longer felt like a misunderstanding. It felt like a revelation. When I finally drove home, the silence around me felt different than before. It wasn't heavy or confusing anymore. It was clear, focused, almost sharp. Daniel was in the living room when I walked in. He looked up the moment he saw me, reading my expression without needing to ask too many questions. "You went to see them," he said quietly. I nodded. He studied my face for a moment, and I took a deep breath, then sat down across from him. "You were right," I said. There was no satisfaction in his expression, no sense of victory. Just a quiet understanding. "I heard them talking," I continued, my voice steady. "They think I'm a burden. They don't want to help. They don't even care how I'm doing." Saying it out loud should have hurt more. But instead, it felt like I was finally letting go of something I had been holding on to for too long. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his tone calm but firm. "Now you know the truth." I nodded again. But this time, something inside me felt different. The pain was still there, but it wasn't overwhelming. It wasn't controlling me. Because for the first time, I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't questioning their behavior. I wasn't making excuses for them. I saw them clearly. And once you see something clearly, you can't go back to pretending it's something else. And that's when I realized that I wasn't heartbroken anymore. I was awake that night, after everything I had heard outside my parents' door. Something inside me felt permanently shifted. It wasn't just disappointment anymore. It was clarity so sharp that it left no room for doubt. For years, I had built an image of my family, in my mind an image filled with love, loyalty, and support. But now, that image had cracked, and what stood in its place was something much colder and more honest. I sat quietly in the living room, staring at nothing in particular. The house felt unusually still, as if it understood that something important had just changed. Daniel didn't rush me, didn't ask too many questions. He simply gave me space, watching me with the kind of patience that made me feel safe without needing words. After a long silence, I finally spoke. "I heard everything," I said, my voice calm but heavy. "They don't see me as their daughter anymore. Not really. Just a problem." Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "I'm sorry you had to hear it like that," he said. I nodded, but I didn't look at him. My mind was still replaying every word, every tone, every pause in their conversation. "They didn't even hesitate," I continued. "No concern. No confusion. Just distance. Like they had already decided I wasn't worth the effort." There was no anger in my voice, which surprised even me. It was more like I was describing something I had finally accepted. Daniel remained quiet for a moment before speaking again. "Emma, what you saw today, that wasn't sudden. That's who they've always been. You just didn't have a reason to see it before." I closed my eyes briefly, letting that sink in. It hurt, but not in the way it would have before. This time, it felt like the pain came with understanding, and that made it easier to carry. "I keep thinking about everything I've done for them," I said. "All the times I helped, supported, sacrificed. I thought it meant something. I thought it made our bond stronger." "It did," Daniel replied softly. "But not in the way you believed. It made you valuable to them, not necessarily loved in the way you deserved." That distinction hit me deeply. Valuable, but not loved. For a long time, I had confused the two. I believed that being needed was the same as being cared for. I thought that the more I gave, the stronger our relationship would become. But now I could see it clearly. My value in their lives was tied to what I could offer, not who I was as a person. I opened my eyes and finally looked at Daniel. "So what do I do now?" I asked. It wasn't a question filled with desperation. It was calm, direct, and focused. For the first time, I wasn't asking how to fix things with my family. I was asking what came next for me. Daniel leaned back slightly, considering his answer. "You don't confront them," he said. "You don't argue, you don't explain, and you don't try to change their minds." I frowned slightly. "Then what?" "You show them the truth," he said. "But not with words, with actions." I stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. "Right now, they believe you have nothing," he explained. "They believe you've lost everything, and because of that, they've chosen to step away. Let them believe that. Let them live with that decision." I felt a small shift inside me as I started to understand what he meant. "And then?" I asked. "And then you rebuild," he said simply. "Quietly, without them. You focus on yourself, your life, your success. And when the truth finally reveals itself, they'll see exactly what they walked away from." There was no bitterness in his tone, no desire for dramatic revenge. It was calm, strategic, and controlled. And for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt since this all began. Control. Not over them, but over myself. Over my choices. Over what I allowed in my life. "I don't want to hurt them," I said after a moment. "I'm not trying to get revenge." Daniel nodded. "This isn't about hurting them. It's about seeing things clearly and choosing what you deserve. If they feel something later, that's a result of their own actions, not yours." That made sense. For so long, I had been focused on maintaining relationships, keeping everyone happy, making sure no one felt uncomfortable. But now, for the first time, I was thinking about what I needed, what I deserved, and what I was willing to accept moving forward. I leaned back in my seat, taking a slow breath. So I just let them go? I asked. Not forcefully, Daniel replied. Just stop holding on. His words settled into my mind with quiet strength. I didn't need to cut them off in anger. I didn't need to confront them with accusations or demand explanations. I didn't need closure from them. Because I already had it. They had shown me who they were when they thought I had nothing. And that was enough. I looked around the room, noticing how peaceful everything felt, despite the situation. For the first time in days, my thoughts weren't racing. There was no confusion, no constant questioning, no emotional chaos. Just clarity. I trusted them completely, I said softly. And now, I don't think I can ever see them the same way again. Daniel didn't try to change that. You're not supposed to, he said. Once you see the truth, your perspective changes. That's not a loss. That's growth. Growth. The word felt strange in this context, but it also felt right, because even though I had lost something in illusion, a belief, a version of my family, I had gained something just as important. Awareness. And with that awareness came a new kind of strength. A strength that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or presence. I wasn't the same person I had been a week ago. I wasn't blindly trusting. I wasn't constantly giving. I wasn't ignoring the signs anymore. I was aware, focused, and finally ready to move forward on my own terms. And for the first time, I understood that the truth, no matter how painful, was far more valuable than any comfortable lie. Once the truth had settled in, everything became quieter, more controlled, and strangely more focused. There was no dramatic confrontation, no emotional outburst, and no final message sent to my family. Instead, there was a decision clear, intentional, and firm. I wasn't going to chase them anymore, and I wasn't going to explain myself. I had already seen what I needed to see. The next step wasn't about reacting to them. It was about choosing myself. Daniel and I sat down the following morning and spoke about what came next. Not in an emotional way, but in a practical, almost strategic manner. It felt different from any conversation we had before. This time it wasn't about feelings or assumptions. It was about direction. So what's the plan? I asked, looking at him with a steady expression. We stepped back, he said. Completely. I nodded slowly. No contact? Only if necessary, he replied. But no effort. No reaching out. No updates. Let them believe whatever they want to believe. It sounded simple, but I knew it wasn't easy. For years, my routine had included them, calls, visits, messages, involvement in every part of my life. Cutting that out, even quietly, would feel like removing a habit that had defined me. Still, I agreed. That same day, I made changes that felt small on the surface, but carried a deeper meaning. I stopped initiating conversations. I muted family group chats. I avoided social media where I knew I might see updates about them or feel tempted to check if they had reached out. It wasn't about anger. It was about creating distant space for myself to think clearly without being pulled back into old patterns. At first, it felt strange. I would pick up my phone out of habit, almost expecting a message, then remember there wouldn't be one. I would think about calling my mother or checking in with my sister, then stop myself halfway through the thought. It wasn't painful in a sharp way, but it was unfamiliar, like learning to live without something that had always been there. But with each passing day, that unfamiliar feeling started to shift. It became lighter, more manageable, more peaceful, more peaceful. At the same time, I turned my full attention toward my work. My business had never actually been in trouble. The idea that I was broke was nothing more than a test. But now it became something else, a shield. It allowed me to operate without expectations, without interruptions, without anyone asking for a share of what I was building. I started working longer hours, but it didn't feel exhausting. It felt purposeful. Every decision I made was focused, calculated, and intentional. I wasn't just maintaining what I had built. I was expanding it. New ideas came more easily. Opportunities that I might have ignored before suddenly felt worth exploring. I took risks I wouldn't have taken in the past. Not out of desperation, but out of confidence. And for the first time, everything I was building felt like it truly belonged to me. Daniel played a quiet, but important role in all of this. He didn't interfere or take control. Instead, he supported me in ways that didn't demand attention. He helped me stay grounded, reminded me to stay focused, and occasionally asked questions that pushed me to think deeper about my decisions. One evening, as we sat reviewing some plans, he looked at me and said, "Do you feel the difference?" I paused for a moment, considering the question. "Yes," I replied. "There's no pressure anymore." And that was the truth. There was no pressure to constantly give, to prove myself, or to maintain an image. There was no expectation hanging over me, no hidden obligation attached to my success. There was just me, my work, and my choices. Weeks passed, then months. And during that time, something interesting happened. No one came looking for me. No unexpected visits, no emotional messages, no attempts to reconnect. The silence from my family remained exactly as it had been from the beginning. At one point, I asked Daniel, "Do you think they even think about me?" He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "People think about what benefits them. Right now, they believe you have nothing to offer." There was no bitterness in his tone, just a simple observation. And strangely, hearing that didn't hurt anymore. Because I understood it now. I wasn't waiting for them to come back. I wasn't hoping for an apology or a sudden realization on their part. That part of me, the part that needed their validation, had already started to fade. In its place was something stronger. Independence. Not the kind that comes from being alone, but the kind that comes from knowing you don't need to rely on people who only value you conditionally. My routine became stable, predictable in the best way. Work, planning, growth, and quiet moments at home. There was a sense of control in my life that I hadn't experienced before, and it came from removing the noise that had once surrounded me. I didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. I didn't feel the need to explain my choices. And most importantly, I didn't feel the need to chase people who had already chosen to walk away. The distance I had created was no longer just physical or emotional. It had become a boundary, a clear line between who I used to be and who I was becoming. And for the first time, I realized that stepping away wasn't a loss. It was the beginning of something far more powerful than I had ever expected. As the months passed, the silence that once felt strange became part of my normal life. There were no interruptions, no unexpected demands, and no emotional distractions pulling me in different directions. What remained was a clear path, one that I had complete control over. And for the first time, I wasn't dividing my energy between my own goals and other people's expectations. I focused entirely on my business. What started as a steady recovery turned into something much bigger. Without constant distractions, I had the time and mental space to think more strategically. I began analyzing my work in a way I hadn't before, identifying areas that could grow and weaknesses that needed to be fixed. I stopped making decisions based on urgency or pressure, and started making them based on long-term vision. Every step I took felt deliberate. I expanded my services, reached out to larger clients, and explored opportunities that once seemed out of reach. At first, it required patience. Not everything worked immediately, and there were moments where progress felt slow. But this time I didn't rush the process. I allowed things to build naturally, layer by layer, and slowly the results started to show. One successful deal led to another. Small wins turned into consistent growth. My reputation in the industry strengthened, and people began to take notice. Clients who once hesitated now approached me with confidence. Partnerships that I had once chased now came to me without effort. It wasn't sudden, but it was undeniable. My business wasn't just stable, it was growing faster than it ever had before. At the same time, I made a conscious decision to stay completely silent about it. There were no announcements, no social media updates, no public displays of success. I kept everything private, known only to a small circle of people I trusted. To the outside world, especially my family, I was still the same person who had lost everything. And I wanted it to stay that way. It wasn't about hiding out of fear, it was about observing. I wanted to see how long their distance would last, how consistent their behavior would be when they believed I had nothing to offer. I wasn't testing them anymore. I was studying the reality I had already uncovered. And the reality didn't change. No one reached out. No one checked in. No one showed even the smallest sign of concern or curiosity. At first I thought maybe someone would eventually break the silence. Maybe my mother would call out of habit. Maybe my sister would send a casual message. But weeks turned into months, and nothing happened. It confirmed everything I had already realized. Their connection to me had never been unconditional. While they remained distant, my life continued to move forward in ways they couldn't see. I opened a new office in a better location, hired more staff, and streamlined my operations. The work environment I created felt stronger, more efficient, and more aligned with the vision I had always had, but never fully pursued. There was a different kind of satisfaction in building something quietly. Without external validation or attention, every achievement felt more personal. It wasn't about impressing anyone anymore. It was about creating something solid, something that reflected my effort and discipline. One evening, after a long day of meetings, I sat in my office looking around at everything I had built. The space was modern, polished, and alive with activity. Employees moved with purpose, conversations flowed with energy, and everything around me reflected growth. Daniel walked in, observing the scene with a calm smile. "You've built something strong," he said. I looked at him, then back at the office. "Stronger than before," I replied. He nodded slightly, and quieter. That word stood out. Quieter. There was power in that silence. No noise, no distractions, no unnecessary attention. Just steady, controlled progress. "Do you ever feel like telling them?" I asked after a moment. "Just to see how they react?" Daniel considered the question before answering. "Not yet," he said. "Right now, they're showing you who they are when they believe you have nothing. That's valuable information." I understood what he meant. If I revealed the truth too soon, everything would change again. Their behavior would shift, their tone would soften, and their presence would return. But it wouldn't be genuine. It would be influenced by what they thought I had regained. Keeping the truth hidden allowed me to see them clearly, and clarity had become more important to me than anything else. So I stayed silent. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. My success continued to grow, but so did my emotional distance from the people I once relied on. It wasn't forced or dramatic. It happened naturally, as a result of everything I had seen and understood. I no longer felt the urge to reach out. I no longer wondered why they weren't calling. I no longer needed their presence to feel complete. Instead, I felt something else. Stability. Confidence. Control. The kind of control that comes from knowing your worth without needing anyone else to confirm it. And as my life continued to rise, one thing remained exactly the same. They still believed I had fallen. By the time I decided to step back into the public eye, my life had already changed in ways that my family could not have imagined. For months, I had built in silence, moved in silence, and grown in silence. My success was no longer a question, it was a reality. But keeping it hidden had its purpose. It gave me clarity, control, and most importantly, a full understanding of who stood by me and who didn't. Now it was time for a return. I didn't rush the decision. It came after careful thought, after observing my own growth and understanding that hiding forever wasn't the goal. The goal was to show the truth when the moment was right. And that moment had finally arrived. The opportunity came through a major business event. It was something I would have been invited to before, but had chosen to ignore during my period of silence. This time, I accepted the invitation, not to prove anything, but to present myself as I truly was, without hiding, without fear, and without pretending to be something I wasn't. The day of the event, I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my appearance. I looked at myself closely, not just physically, but mentally. The woman standing there was no longer the same person who had walked into that family meeting months ago. There was a quiet confidence in my eyes, a sense of calm that came from understanding my own worth. Daniel stood beside me, watching quietly. "You ready?" he asked. I met his gaze and nodded. Yes, there was no hesitation, no fear, no anxiety, just certainty. When I arrived at the venue, the atmosphere was alive with energy. People were dressed professionally, conversations filled the room, and the environment reflected success, ambition, and growth. I walked in with a calm, steady presence, not drawing attention to myself, but not avoiding it either. Within minutes, people began to notice. Some recognized me immediately. Others learned my name through conversations. My work, my achievements, and my growth had already circulated in certain circles, and now those details were becoming visible in real time. I didn't chase attention. It came naturally. The first major moment happened when I was introduced on stage. As my name was announced, I walked forward with confidence, every step deliberate and steady. The room quieted as people focused their attention on me. For the first time in months, I stood in a position where people were listening, watching, and evaluating. Not because I needed their approval, but because I had earned my place there. As I spoke, I kept my words clear and purposeful. I didn't exaggerate, and I didn't over-explain. I spoke about growth, resilience, and building something from the ground up. I spoke about challenges, not as setbacks, but as lessons. And most importantly, I spoke with a level of confidence that came from experience, not just theory. The response was immediate. People were impressed, not just by what I said, but by how I carried myself. After the event, the shift became even more visible. People approached me, introduced themselves, and showed interest in my work. Opportunities started appearing, conversations started forming, and connections began building. But the most interesting moment came later that evening. My phone, which had remained quiet for so long, started to light up. Notifications, messages, calls. At first, I didn't check immediately. I continued my conversations, staying present in the moment, but I already knew what was happening. Eventually, when I checked my phone, I saw names I recognized immediately. My family, my mother, my father, my siblings. Their messages were different from before. Where there had once been silence, there was now attention. "Emma, we heard about your event. We're so proud of you. Let's meet soon. We missed you." The tone had completely changed. Gone was the distance. Gone was the silence. Gone was the indifference. Now, there was warmth. Interest. Reconnection. But something inside me felt different as I read those messages. There was no rush to reply. No emotional reaction. No immediate urge to respond. I simply observed them. Same people. Same relationships. Different behavior. Daniel noticed my expression when I showed him the messages. "Predictable," he said calmly. I nodded. "Completely." He looked at me for a moment. "So what do you want to do?" I didn't answer right away. I thought about it carefully. This was the moment that would define everything. If I responded with excitement, things would go back to how they were before: expectations, pressure, and imbalance. If I responded with distance, it would reinforce the boundaries I had already built. "I'll respond," I said finally. "But on my terms." And that's exactly what I did. Not immediately. Not emotionally. Not with the same energy they were now giving me. I replied calmly, with controlled responses, keeping the balance in my favor. For the first time, the dynamic had shifted. I was no longer the one chasing validation or connection. They were the ones trying to reconnect with me. And that change was something none of them had expected, because they had walked away when they thought I had nothing. But now, they were the ones coming back when they realized I had everything. The messages from my family didn't just continue after the event. They multiplied. At first, I ignored them, letting them sit unread while I focused on my work and daily routine. For months, there had been nothing from them. No concern, no interest, no effort. Now suddenly, my phone was filled with notifications. It felt almost unreal, like I had stepped into a different timeline where their behavior had been completely rewritten. My mother's messages were the most emotional. She spoke about how worried she had been, how she didn't understand what I was going through, and how much she missed me. My father's tone was more controlled, more formal, asking to meet and saying that it was important. My siblings followed with similar messages, expressing pride, warmth, and a sudden desire to reconnect. The same people who had avoided me when they thought I had nothing were now reaching out with enthusiasm, as if the past had never happened. I didn't reply right away. I needed time to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just about communication, it was about patterns. I had already seen how they behaved when they thought I was struggling. Now I needed to see how long this new behavior would last. I watched the messages carefully, noticing how quickly they responded when I didn't reply, how their tone shifted when I stayed silent, and how eager they were to get a response from me. That alone told me something important. The urgency was no longer one-sided. After observing for a few days, I finally responded with a simple message. I agreed to meet them, but I didn't add emotion or excitement. I kept it short and controlled. The meeting was set at my office, and I chose that location intentionally. It wasn't just a meeting, it wasn't representation of everything I had built during the months they thought I had nothing. I wanted them to see it, to understand it, and to feel the difference without me having to explain it in words. When the day came, I arrived early. I stood in my office, looking around at everything. The design, the energy, the people working around me. It all reflected growth, discipline, and success. There was a quiet confidence in the space, something that couldn't be faked. I wasn't nervous, but I was aware. This meeting wasn't about proving anything. It was about observing how they reacted to the truth. When my family arrived, their expressions said everything before they even spoke. They walked into the office and immediately noticed the environment. The professionalism, the activity, the atmosphere, it didn't match the image they had in their minds of me struggling or losing everything. My mother smiled quickly and came forward to hug me, her voice filled with warmth. My father looked around first, taking in the surroundings before speaking, while my siblings followed with polite smiles and careful behavior. There was a visible difference in how they carried themselves compared to before. They were more attentive, more aware, and more cautious in their words. We sat down together, and for a few moments, no one spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't natural either. It felt controlled, like everyone was waiting for the other person to take the lead. My mother broke the silence first, talking about how worried they had been, and how they didn't know how to react when I said I had lost everything. Her voice was softer now, more careful, as if she was trying to reconnect emotionally. I listened without interrupting. My expression remained calm, but my mind was processing every word. My father added that they had given me space because they didn't want to overwhelm me. He spoke as if their absence was an act of consideration rather than distance. My siblings nodded along, agreeing with the narrative they had created. But I noticed something important. None of them acknowledged the pain, the silence, or the way they had truly responded when they thought I had nothing. So I spoke. Not with anger, not with emotion, but with clarity. I asked questions that made them pause, that made them think. I repeated their words back to them, slowly, carefully, allowing them to hear how their actions and explanations didn't fully align. I reminded them of what had happened when I told them I was struggling, how quickly the distance appeared, how easily they stepped back. I didn't accuse, I simply stated what I had observed. The room became quiet again. Their responses became more careful, more thoughtful, but also more hesitant. They tried to explain their actions, to justify their absence, to soften the situation with words that sounded better than the reality. My mother admitted that they may have made a mistake, but even that sounded incomplete, as if it was difficult for her to fully accept. My father maintained his composed tone, but there was a subtle shift in his expression. something that suggested he understood the situation differently now. I listened to everything, but I didn't respond the way I might have before. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't try to prove a point. Instead, I observed their reactions, their tone, and their behavior. Because now, I wasn't trying to fix the past. I was understanding it. After a while, I stood up, signaling that the meeting was coming to an end. They looked at me, waiting for something more, maybe a resolution, maybe reassurance, maybe forgiveness expressed in the way they expected. But I didn't give them that. I simply thanked them for coming and acknowledged the conversation. Before they left, I made one thing clear without raising my voice or turning the situation into a confrontation. I told them that starting over wasn't as simple as words. It required change, consistency, and actions that matched intentions. They listened, but their silence told me they understood the weight of what I was saying. And as they walked out of my office, I realized something important. The balance had changed, and so had I. After that meeting, something inside me finally settled. It wasn't excitement, and it wasn't sadness. It was a quiet sense of completion, like a long, exhausting chapter of my life had reached its natural end. My family had seen the truth, and I had seen their reaction. There was nothing left to chase, nothing left to prove, and nothing left to explain. For the first time in a long time, I felt light. Not because everything was perfect, but because I was no longer carrying the weight of expectations from people who had shown me their true priorities. I had stopped waiting for them to understand, stopped hoping they would suddenly change into something they had never been. That acceptance gave me something powerful: freedom. But this wasn't about revenge. It never was. It was about truth. The truth that had been hidden behind years of blind trust. The truth that became visible only when I stopped giving and started observing. The truth that revealed who stayed and who walked away when things were uncertain. And now that I had that truth, I had a choice. I could either hold on to the past or move forward with it. I chose to move forward. Slowly, my life began to shift again, but this time in a different direction. I didn't build out of pressure or to prove a point. I built because I wanted to. I refined my business, strengthened my team, and expanded my vision further than before. Every decision I made was intentional, every step aligned with the future I wanted for myself. There was no rush anymore, no urgency to fix relationships, no pressure to meet expectations, just steady, consistent growth. Daniel remained by my side through it all. He didn't push me, didn't interfere, and didn't try to control the direction I was going in. He simply supported me quietly, reminding me when needed, encouraging me when I questioned myself, and respecting every boundary I set. One evening, we sat together after a long day, the city lights glowing softly outside the window. The atmosphere was calm, almost reflective. I looked at him and said, "Everything feels different now." He nodded. "Because you're different." I thought about that for a moment. He was right. I wasn't the same person who had depended on approval, who had given without limits, who had ignored the signs just to maintain peace. I had learned, grown, and changed in ways I never expected. "Do you ever think about them?" he asked after a pause. I didn't answer immediately. I took a moment, not to avoid the question, but to understand my own feelings. "Not the way I used to," I said finally. That was the truth. They still existed in my life, but they no longer occupied the same space in my mind. They no longer controlled my emotions or influenced my decisions. They were no longer the center of my world. That space had been replaced by something else: clarity, peace, and purpose. In the following days, I continued focusing on my work, but my approach had changed. I wasn't chasing growth anymore. I was building it carefully, sustainably, and with intention. I paid attention to details, strengthened relationships with my team, and ensured that everything I created reflected the standards I now held for myself. At the same time, I maintained my distance from my family, not out of anger, but out of understanding. When they reached out, I responded calmly, without emotional dependency. When they spoke, I listened, but I no longer absorbed everything the same way. I had created boundaries that protected my peace, and I wasn't willing to compromise them. The dynamic between us had shifted permanently. They no longer saw me the same way, and I no longer saw them the same way. It wasn't about blame anymore. It was about reality. And reality doesn't always align with what we want it to be. There were moments when I reflected on everything that had happened. The test I had set, the silence that followed, the return after success, and the final meeting where everything became clear. Each part of the journey had led me to this point, shaping the person I had become. I realized something important during those reflections. Sometimes people don't leave when you lose something. They reveal themselves. And sometimes you don't need revenge to move forward. You just need clarity. One day, while sitting in my office, I looked around and felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for my success, but for the journey that brought me here. The painful moments, the silence, the realization, they all played a role in helping me understand what truly matters. Not everyone who is close to you will stand by you when things are uncertain, but the ones who do, they define your life in ways nothing else can. And as I closed my laptop and prepared to leave for the day, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. My story wasn't about what I lost. It was about what I finally understood, and how I chose to move forward with it. Thank you for staying with this journey till the end. If this story made you think, feel, or reflect, then don't forget to show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more powerful stories like this. Your support helps us grow and bring you even better content. We'd also love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us which country you're watching from and what part of the story impacted you the most. Your feedback means a lot and keeps this community connected. Until next time, stay strong, stay focused, and keep moving forward.